It's great to attend a meeting of this character in New York, and not so far away from the Empire State Building. I do remember John Peterson and myself many years ago coming to New York when we had no one in the States, and said, one day we'll have an organization in New York and offices. And we've accomplished it, and not only in New York, but branches around the country. And that's down to the enormous work and dedication of comrades. And above all, I say the ideas which are decisive in building an organization of tendencies such as ours. Clearly, the task we have in front of us is a great one. Our task is to overthrow capitalism internationally. And in order to do that, we need to be prepared. And that means we have to learn. We have to prepare ourselves for this mighty task. And in doing so, we stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before us. And above all, we have to learn the lessons. After all, theory is the generalized experience of the workers' movement. And on that basis, we will prepare ourselves for the events that lie ahead. So this school is, although it's a school of education, it's a preparation, really, for the colossal task of changing society. And I would say a discussion on Germany fits the bill insofar as the German Revolution of 1918 to 1923, together with the rise of fascism as well, or there's enough lessons there to cover a lot more than the time that I've got available. But I think we'll have a very good discussion about this situation. The German Revolution was an extremely important event in 1918, mainly because Germany was in the heart of Europe. And a successful revolution in 1918 would have meant the end of capitalism, not only in Germany, but of the end of capitalism in Europe. And in fact, would have laid the basis for the world revolution, would have broken the isolation of the Russian Revolution, and in that way posed a real decisive question for internationalists. And of course, Lenin himself said he was prepared to abandon, if need be, the Russian Revolution if they could get a successful revolution in Germany. Such was the importance. And it shows the international perspectives of the Bolsheviks. That you couldn't establish socialism in one country, let alone in a backward country like Russia. The material basis for socialism only exists on a world scale. And therefore, our task is, yes, world revolution as the only way to guarantee the emancipation of the working class. Of course, the events of 1918 in Germany are not isolated, but part of a world revolution developing, a European and world revolution. In fact, it's part of the process of this international revolution that emerged after the First World War. In fact, it was Woodrow Wilson who said in March 1919, "We are now in a race with Bolshevism. And the world is on fire," as he put it. And Lloyd George, who was the British Prime Minister, said that the working class has been infected with the spirit of revolt. And that was the general character of this period, 1918, 1919. And there was enormous optimism, I would say, perhaps over-optimism, that the revolution would be successful, given the convulsion of capitalism, the weakness of the capitalist class after the First World War, and the movement of the workers in all countries. But of course, it takes more than just a movement. It takes, above all, a leadership that can carry it through to a conclusion. And that's what was lacking, you could say, apart from in Russia in 1917, in the other countries at this particular time. If you look at the 1918 November Revolution in Germany, there's very many parallels, I would say, with the Russian Revolution in 1917. We should say it was certainly a revolution. Didn't succeed, but it was a revolution. there are certain historians at this point who say, well, they put a question mark. Was it really a revolution? Was it just a revolt? But we take the definition of revolution from Trotsky, which was a very succinct definition in the history of the Russian Revolution. But he said it's a revolution is where you have the entry of the masses on the scene of history, where they take destiny in their own hands. And that certainly was a description of the Russian Revolution and a description of the German Revolution of November 1918. It began as a mutiny in Kiel, in the naval base of Kiel. There was a mutiny in the fleet. And as a consequence, this was the spark that set the revolution alight and spread from town to town throughout a period of days, ended up in Berlin on the 9th of November 1918, which was always characterized as the beginning of the revolution, although it did begin a few days before that. And this revolution established what we would describe as a dual power situation. Insofar as the workers didn't just have a revolution, but they created organs of self-rule. That is, in Russia, they were called Soviets, but in Germany, they were called workers' councils and soldiers' councils, which were spontaneously established, no one called them, spontaneously established by the workers and soldiers themselves in order to put their own stamp on the revolution. And as a result, these were elements, if you like, of potential workers' power in Germany, as the Soviets were in Russia. But of course, Soviets in and of themselves do not mean a successful revolution. They are organs of the revolution. But in Russia, as we know, for the first of 9 months, or most of the 9 months, they were in the hands of reformists. And therefore, they were truncated. It was only on the basis of the Bolsheviks winning a majority in the Soviets in Russia that these organs became the organs of insurrection and of workers' power. And unfortunately, in Germany, they never reached that stage. These organs were thrown up. There was a situation of dual power. The ruling class in Germany lost control of the situation. The state was suspended in midair. And power was in the streets. Power was in the hands of the working class and the soldiers. And if it was just up to them, they could have easily taken power. But of course, it takes more than just that willpower. Because the ruling class also have their strategists and their schemers, and they're desperate to hold on to power with all possible means. And just as we learn from history, so that we can prepare ourselves for the events that are coming, so the ruling class also has its establishments, its strategists of capital, in order to try and preserve the status quo, preserve capitalism. And therefore, they also attempt to use what's available in order to try and maintain that rule of capital. Of course, at that point, they were in a desperate situation. They'd lost control. Power was in the hands of the working class. What could they do under those circumstances? And the only way they could contain the situation was to rest upon the reformist leaders of the German labor movement. Of course, we understand that the German labor movement at that stage was nominally under a banner of Marxism. But we know also that in 1914, there was a betrayal, the biggest betrayal of the workers' movement, where the leaders of the Second International, as it was called, the leaders of the socialist parties, capitulated to the ruling class and supported the war effort. And the internationalists at that stage were reduced to a tiny handful on a world scale. And this was a betrayal, and clearly it set off a differentiation, if you like, of ideas inside the organizations of the working class. And in Germany, we had the embryo of a left wing, of a revolutionary embryo, which was led by Rosa Luxemburg in the first instance, but also Karl Liebknecht as well after 1914. Rosa Luxemburg was an extremely far-sighted revolutionary, and given her day-to-day experience in the German social democracy, she saw at first hand the way in which the leaders of the movement were behaving, that they were speechifying socialism on May days and holidays, but in practice it had become more and more adapted to the capitalist system, reformist in other words. Revolution, they'd lost the sight of revolution. They thought that bit by bit they could gradually change society. That's all. They were very clever, very practical people as they saw. And Rosa Luxemburg saw this danger very early on, even before Lenin actually, in relation to the International. Luxemburg understood the way in which Trotskys in particular, who was the head really of the International, was a centrist figure. In other words, wavering, Marxist in words, but in deeds were reformist. And that then came to a head in 1914, where all these tendencies emerged because it's events that teach everybody, events which test the ground. And they obviously failed the test in 1914. Luxemburg began to form a left wing within inside the social democracy together with Karl Liebknecht. And this was eventually called the Spartacist group, named after the great slave leader rebellion that led the rebellion against Rome. But the weakness that Luxemburg had is that the group was very loose. It was a very loose-knit organization, if you can call it that, as opposed to what Lenin had done in Russia in pre-1914 days. In fact, the great contribution of Lenin was that he understood, more than anybody in the world, the importance of the party, the importance of the Revolutionary Party and leadership. All others had a very hazy view of this, including Rosa Luxemburg, including Trotsky, of Connolly, of other internationalists, great revolutionaries, but Lenin, above all, understood the importance of the party. And the party is important because it acts as the piston box. It galvanizes, brings all our potential together in a centralized way to overthrow capitalism. And that was one of the weaknesses of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. They were great revolutionaries, but they didn't really organize as the Bolsheviks had done in Russia. And that weakness was obviously quite glaring during the revolution of 1918. After all, they were quite small, but the movement itself had also divided by that time. The Social Democratic Party, the biggest party of Marxism in the world, was in Germany, and that split in January 1917 on the basis of events, and a left party was created out of that, called the Independents. And this Independents were far to the left of the social democracy, but they were, again, more centrist in character. You know, in other words, words Marxist, but in deeds very confused. But the Spartacist group participated, first of all, in the social democracy, and then in the Independents, trying to win them to the ideas of Marxism. Of course, everything was overtaken by the events in Russia, which changed the world, and had a big impact not only in Germany, but elsewhere, and precipitated also the feelings of and the revolution of November 1918. And of course, the Spartacists would like to have led the revolution, but they were too weak. They only had 50 members in Berlin, you know, in November at that particular time. So it was very, very small, although they were well known, particularly Luxemburg and Liebknecht. Liebknecht was a member of parliament, and he had been jailed, and both of them had been jailed in the First World War. So they had a certain reputation. But unfortunately, as we said, the Spartacist group was quite weak politically and organizationally. And therefore, they could not take advantage of the revolutionary upsurge of that particular time. The situation in Germany posed a challenge, obviously, for the ruling class. As I explained, the only way out for them was to rest upon the leaders of the social democracy, the right wing. Because in the process of the previous 10 years to the revolution, a new layer of leaders came to the fore in the German social democracy. People like Ebert, Friedrich Ebert, of Scheidemann, of Noske. These were the kind of right-wing individuals who began to dominate the movement. And it was upon these people that the ruling class in Germany had no other alternative but to rest. And as a consequence, and that was revealed in the writings and the speeches of these people, they wanted law and order. The government prior to the November Revolution was led by a prince, Prince von Baden. And he said, "The revolution is on the verge of winning. We cannot crush it, but perhaps we can strangle it." In other words, he realized that the class balance of forces was weighed against them. But the only way they could strangle it was to use the leadership of the social democracy as a brake on the movement, and which they did. And in that way, they had to give power over formally, because power was in the streets, but they wanted to say, give them the government office. So they organized a government of the social democracy, who in turn drew in the independents. So it became a coalition government, not like in Russia. In Russia, there was the first coalition government was a bourgeois government. In Germany, it was a workers' government in that sense, made up of social democrats and the independents. In fact, they adopted the name of commissars. Such was the revolution, the heat of the revolution. They called themselves the People's Commissars, the government of People's Commissars, just on the model of Russia. But that didn't hide the fact that Ebert, for instance, who became the head of the government, said he hated revolution like sin. And he was determined to hold the revolution back as far as they could. And in that way, the whole actions of the government was to try and preserve the status quo. But in doing so, they would have to make an alliance with the military apparatus, who, after all, although they lost control of the situation, they were still there. And the task of the military, of course, was to establish a counter-revolutionary movement, to crystallize, which they later did in the formation of the Freikorps. And the Freikorps was the dregs, if you like, the most reactionary dregs of society, which they armed, and on the basis of the social democratic leaders, prepared the way for counter-revolution in Germany. You can't have a situation which is revolution all the time. A revolution either has to go forward or it will go backwards. It either has to move to a conclusion or it will inevitably end in a retreat and a defeat in that sense. And there was a series of attempts of counter-revolution, and revolution and counter-revolution butt up against each other in these particular years. And the first attempt was in the 6th of December, 1918, so quite quick, a month after the revolution, an attempt at counter-revolution. Then on Christmas Day, 1918, a further attempt. And then we have the development of the Spartacist week, as it was called, which we'll deal with in a minute. So you have these attempts to try and crush the movement, and each time they fail because of fraternization. The revolution's is so hot. The masses are too alert. They're on the streets. They're looking. Of course, as in Russia, as I said, they'd thrown up these organs of power, potential power, the workers' councils. But the workers' councils were dominated by the reformists, by the social democracy. And on the 16th of December, there was a national conference called of these councils. And they, instead of taking power, they decided to put their confidence in the government and to call elections for a national assembly, which obviously was the basis for a counter-revolutionary movement. In other words, to stabilize the situation and then get rid of these councils of action as quickly as possible by electing a parliament, because there wasn't a parliament in Germany of any degree. It was the Reichstag, which is a fig leaf, really. So they wanted a genuine So it was the democratic feelings of the masses as well were leaned upon in order to carry this thing through. Obviously, the Luxemburg in particular had hailed the Russian Revolution, and they saw the need to establish, obviously in March 1919, there was a Communist International was formed, but before that, there was a German Communist Party created at the end of December, on the 31st of December 1918, formed by the Spartacists, who had broken now from the independents and tried to form a party themselves as a means of promoting the ideals of communism. The only problem we have here is that the makeup of this young Communist Party was very, very new. It was very raw, should we, politically very raw and confused. Obviously, Luxemburg was a theoretical giant, but these workers were dedicated workers. They wanted the revolution, but even more than wanting a revolution, you've got to know how to carry through a revolution. And whereas the Bolsheviks had a preparatory period of developing tactics and so on under Lenin's leadership, that didn't take place in Germany. That was the weakness. And therefore, this assembly, this Congress to found the Communist Party was very confused, very ultra-left. At this time, you have a lot of ultra-left ideas floating about. You know, to hell with capitalism, to hell with the parliament, to hell with the trade unions. We want revolution, which is obviously what they did want. But you can't leap over the mass of workers, unfortunately. It cannot be done. You have to understand how to win the workers, the mass of workers, to the ideas of Bolshevism, which means tactics and so on. There needs to be, you understand it, you understand. Otherwise, you like to isolate yourself. And they were very much bristling with ultra-leftism. Didn't want to involve the trade unions. They didn't want to involve themselves in the trade unions. They were dominated by the reformers. Forget them. And Parliament, well, of course, this National Assembly. We want Soviets. We don't want National Assembly. Yeah, but if the masses, have illusions in the National Assembly, then you have to go with the masses and explain to them in the process what you stand for. You use it, in other words, rather than anything else. But they took an abstentionist view, and they made one mistake after another, to be honest about it. And again, this is a process of attempt. And I think it was Rosa Luxemburg who said, well, even a young child squawks when it's born, and that's what this Congress is doing. It was crying and squawking, and it had to be educated. So that was the task of educating these young ladies, impatient layers. But that was going to take some time. It was going to take a bit of effort, and they didn't have a lot of time on their hands. Of course, the revolution was moving, and the counter-revolution above all was moving. And by early January, just a week after the formation of the Communist Party, a provocation was launched, as you do have, where the left-wing police chief in Berlin, who was a member of the Independents, was removed from his position. He resisted, and as a result, there was a movement of support, of solidarity with this police chief. The revolution, if you like, the masses went on the streets. There were demonstrations of 500,000. It was not like a small demonstration. Then there were, hundreds of thousands of workers who were determined to defend the revolution. You get this also in many revolutions, the fear that somehow the revolution is slipping from your hands. It occurs everywhere in a revolutionary context. And the workers try and seize it back. And that's what you had in January 1919. It was called the Spartacist Week, or Uprising. They never planned it. It was a provocation which basically took a form insofar as an armed form of occupations of buildings, of the Vorwärts building, the newspaper of the Social Democracy. Other newspapers were occupied and so on and so forth. Barricades were set up. But you couldn't take power under those circumstances because, first of all, the rest of Germany needed to come to the assistance. Therefore, in reality, you could have a protest, but the character of it was more than a protest. It was an attempted insurrection among certain layers. And then they pull back. I haven't got time to go into all the details. There's quite you can see the way things are moving, but suddenly there's the independents pull back and they don't go for it. And then the Liebknecht in particular is in charge of this organizing committee, and he decides to go for broke. I mean, there's lots of things that happened in those circumstances which led to this unfortunate set of circumstances which were defeated. Then the counter-revolution was able to mobilize, and the government was able to mobilize and crush the event, and began a process then of counter-revolution. You know, it moves from revolution to counter-revolution, and it ends up with the murder of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, which was a real tragedy, unbelievable tragedy, because they were the authority and also had the know-how, which is a very valuable thing. It's like Lenin and Trotsky being murdered before the revolution, if you like. Which would have derailed the Russian Revolution, as a matter of fact. Anyway, we can go into that perhaps in more discussion. But the event of January the 15th, 1919, and the murder of Luxemburg and Liebknecht was a terrible blow to the German working class. And of course, a week later, you had the elections to the National Assembly, and the communists had boycotted it. And yet the masses turned and voted overwhelmingly in that election, because that was a democratic demand that they wanted to, you know, they saw the way forward, if you like. And the Social Democracy and the Independents got a big vote. I think it was 45% of the vote, a huge vote. The right-wing parties had changed their names. They became Democratic parties. You know, they changed the name to become more democratic, you know, facade for the masses. Shows how weak the things were at that particular time. The heat of the revolution was still there, even on the basis of this movement towards counter-revolution. So the big tragedy was not creating a revolutionary tendency beforehand that could have become more of a powerful and trained them and educated them beforehand, as had happened in Russia. And therefore, we were going to pay the price of this. And the task was still to accumulate the cadres, of course, under very, very difficult circumstances. The counter-revolution marched through Berlin, then into central Germany throughout 1919. Internationally, the Hungarian victory, the Soviet Republic established in Hungary, a defeat of the Republic. In Bavaria, the workers take power. Again, a defeated, butchered in early May 1919. So the whole thing is revolution, counter-revolution. There's a tremendous optimism, by the way, that somehow they think they're going to win because the capitalism is so weak. But the decisive thing is the leadership, and this brings it home. The failure of leadership, really, and the need to create a revolutionary party that can lead the masses not into premature conflicts, but to lead the masses at each step in order to take power along the line. And therefore, a lot of education needed to be done. In 1920, for instance, you had the formation of the Communist International, and it's not just Germany, but everywhere else. All the parties are being created, but they're very ultra-left. You know, they're very honest people. They're determined to take power, but just don't know how to do it, and therefore they make mistakes. And Lenin then draws up this document, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, which is a brilliant document, which everybody should read and reread, because the tactics, explains the Bolshevik tactics of how to operate under concrete circumstances and not have some highfalutin idea about revolution, a romantic idea of revolution. You have to understand the laws of revolutionary development, how you fit into it, how the masses move. Because, the revolution will be made by the working class, not by a minority, by the majority. And how do you win the majority to the banner of the socialist revolution? All these are questions, which means you participate in things like trade unions, right-wing trade unions, where you participate in parliament in order to have a tribune to launch out to the people, use the positions that are available for the revolution, in other words, and not to have prima donna kind of viewpoint about how you should operate. And even the Bolsheviks, they operated within trade unions set up by the police. I mean, police unions. In other words, they were looking all sorts of angles in order to try and get to the workers. In other words, shows a flexibility, if you like, of tactics, which are very important. And people were educated then on these ideas by the Bolsheviks and the experience of Bolshevism. And of course, you had, in Germany, it had a huge effect because the Communist International was formed, and then you have, on the basis of big events, the change in the working class. In the early 1920, the military in Germany take a different view. They don't want any, they want to establish the old order. They want untrammeled power. And therefore they went for a coup led by Cap, a man called Cap, which was launched in early 1920, where the army mutinied, basically, and a counter-revolutionary movement entered Berlin under this leadership of Cap. And the government in Berlin deserted it and left Berlin. And in effect, power was in the hands of the military, although that's it seemed. But in fact, there was a general strike called. Even the reformists were forced to call a general strike, and which had a big effect everywhere, in Berlin and other cities, and led to the collapse of the coup. They couldn't even find a stenographer to carry out write down the decrees of the government, this military government. They were paralyzed. They were just left in midair. But the significance of this, first of all, the Young Communist Party had an ultra-left view. They said, oh, it's a struggle between two heads, of the ruling class. We won't bother with it. Unlike, for instance, in Russia, when the Bolsheviks are faced with a coup of Kornilov in the end of August 1917, they launch a united front to attack the main enemy, first of all, of Kornilov, to defeat the coup. Once they were able to do that, then they would turn their attention to Kerensky. But the German party was very ultra-left. Oh, no, they're all the same. We don't bother, we don't care. Although they did then change the line later on and realized they'd made a mistake. But the significance of 1920 and the coup, or the attempted coup and the failure, was a dramatic radicalization of the situation in Germany. Huge radicalization, which affected the independent party. And the independents were now becoming more and more under the influence of the Russian Revolution and so on. And as a result, at the Halle Congress in 1920, Zinoviev came over and spoke for 4 hours to convince them to join the Third International. And after that debate that took place, they won the party over. The majority came over to the Communist International, and they, for the first time, did a fusion of the smaller Communist Party. They became a mass organization in Germany. This is what we're looking at now, a mass force. I mean, the independents had about 800,000. Probably the Communist Party had about 500,000 members at that time. Difficult to assess, but roughly about that. It was a mass party with daily papers, many daily papers, influence in the trade unions, everything you think of. They had it. Of course, they needed to be trained and educated. And that was, again, one of the problems. You can have a mass party, unless the leadership is educated, you can make mistakes. And that's precisely what happened in 1921. We can jump forward 1 year, within a matter of months, actually, because the idea was raised. In fact, I can't go into too much detail. A man called Bela Kun, who led the Hungarian Revolution, very ultra-left. He was seconded to Germany, and he tried to do basically promote these ultra-left ideas. And it's what he called the theory of the offensive. Sounds very nice, the theory of the offensive. That somehow we must detonate the German working class to provoke a revolution in Germany, to defend the gains of the Russian Revolution, which were under threat. And this madness, it was a mad idea, because they were going to take a shortcut, for want of a better word, in order to electrify the workers by all sorts of means. They were going to kidnap people. They were going to call general strikes, which they didn't have a basis for. Oh, they were going to, I mean, amazing ultra-left adventurism, basically. They try and stir the workers into action. But they weren't a small group. They were quite a large group. And they were going to support the miners' strike in central Germany and stage an insurrection, if they could, on the basis of this mass movement. And it led to a massive defeat of the workers. And many workers, they tried to put up picket lines to stop workers going into work, and so all crazy ideas. And as a result, it led to a defeat, a big defeat, where people were jailed, lost their jobs. Half the membership of the Communist Party left. So 400,000, they went down to 200,000. Half of them just, they left under that huge defeat. And Lenin and Trotsky were determined that they'd learn the lessons of this defeat. And that was discussed at the Third Congress of the Communist International. The International, these international conferences, congresses, it was like a university for the education of the party, of the sections. And therefore they would discuss all tactical and strategic questions arising at every point. And this one was obviously, was this correct or not? And you had many people in Germany and elsewhere saying, this is the way forward. No matter if we were defeated, this is the way forward. And Lenin and Trotsky said, no, you'll destroy everything. You go down that road, you'll destroy the party, you'll destroy the movement. And we cannot afford to do that. And therefore, Lenin once said that he stood on the right wing of the Congress. He was a right-winger, he said, attacking these ultra-lefts, because if he didn't correct this line, it would destroy the Communist International. And therefore, Lenin, Trotsky used the weight of their political authority to convince the majority of delegates that this was not the way forward, and that they would have to patiently explain their ideas. And above all, they would need to win the working class, not conquer power, but conquer the working class. You have to win a majority first. And that has to be done through patient explanation of tactics and strategy that coincides with that particular objective. And the idea was born of the united front. You need to conduct united front work. In other words, you must link up the reformist workers on practical questions with wages, attacks by capitalism, or still whatever it is. Link up and show in action how you and your ideas are superior to the reformist ideas and their methods. And with this turn towards when you got mass reformist parties, which still occurred in Germany, Social Democrats were still a large organization in Germany, and the reformers still dominated the trade unions, you would have to use these methods to convince the rank and file. If the trade union leaders didn't want to play ball, well, it exposes them in the eyes of the rank and file. If they did and were participating in a united front activity, the communists would show through their actions and their ideas they would be the best. You know, we would influence those workers to come with the movement. So that was the idea of a united front tactic of winning the masses against ultra-leftism, patiently explaining these are the methods you're going to build up the communist movement, which they did quite successfully in 1922 with this kind of turn. They abandoned this road and they turned towards the ideas of United Front, not popular frontism, which is the opposite. United Front is where you connect, if like you march separately but strike together. In other words, you have your own banner, you have your own ideas, but you link up with other workers or trade unions in order to fight for a certain common aim. As opposed to a popular front, which is adopted later on, where you basically drop all your ideas and you accept the ideas of your opponents, and in fact the reformists. You water down your ideas in order to get a greater hearing. So it's the united front, which is the key aspect of Leninist politics, you want to put it that way. And they built up, and they were quite successful in 22, early 23. But again, events in Germany put the party to a test. That was in early 1923. because of the, perhaps as you know, in 1919, let's go back a couple of years, you had the Versailles Treaty, which is a defeat treaty for Germany, and they were forced to pay reparations and so on. They couldn't pay the reparations by 1923, and therefore the French and the Belgians sent in troops into the Ruhr area, which was the main steel and coal area of Germany, to seize the assets, basically. And this resulted in, I can imagine, a big movement of opposition, and the Communist Party played a very important role in that opposition to the occupation. And it resulted in quite a convulsive movement. I can't go into details. On the economic front, it led to a colossal inflation. I think I had the figures here. I don't know. I wrote them down somewhere because even I couldn't believe the figures. I don't know if I got them here. Number 3. Yes, here it is. Well, I don't even know what it means. In 1919, there were 4.2 marks to the dollar. 4.2 marks to $1. In November 1923, there were 4,200 million. I mean, all I know is it's 4.2 followed by 11 noughts. Right? So that gives you an idea. 6 noughts is a million, but 11 noughts per dollar. Zeros. Sorry, zeros. To speak proper English. I mean, inflation was raging. It was hyperinflation. What's the point in paying trade union dues? Trade unions became useless under those circumstances. And workers are drawing revolutionary conclusions from the situation. Unfortunately, of course, in Russia, which was able to guide the movement, by this time, there was a change in the situation in Russia, where Lenin was ill, and he was to die in January 1924. In 1923, he was paralyzed. There was a troika, in effect, was in power of Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Stalin, who intrigued against Trotsky because they wanted the power not to edge Trotsky out. And these maneuverings led then to quite a disastrous situation where the advice given to the German Communist Party was not to build up and to prepare for the revolution, but to go slow. In fact, I did have the quote here somewhere, where Stalin writes to, I think it's to Zinoviev, we must restrain the Germans. Let the fascists, as they put, strike first. And they built up this idea that fascism was a danger. And it wasn't a real danger. They were looking the wrong way. Revolution was on the order of the day. And yet they failed to recognize this. Trotsky had been ill and also out of action. And the new leader of the German Communist Party, Brandler, came to Moscow in order to get advice. And the advice was basically, well, first of all, go slow. And then when the situation became overripe, extremely ripe by September, they tried to catch up with the situation. Hundreds were formed in Germany, and others, groups of 100 workers were organized, military units were being formed, and the situation was getting more and more ripe for revolution. Workers were streaming from from the social democracy to the Communist Party. There was a huge shift in opinion in Germany at this particular time. In other words, it was becoming ripe for revolution this time now, not like in 1921. This was not going to be an adventure. You have a mass party in Germany that could take power under these circumstances. Unfortunately, the German communist leadership were not up to the mark. They were prevaricating, and this was transmitted, if you like. A prevarication does transmit to the ranks of the party. Unless you're decisive and know where you're going, then obviously this can happen. And they talk about an insurrection. Trotsky says, name the date. Name the date. No, they didn't want to name a date. And eventually they hit on the idea of a trade union conference in Chemnitz, which should be the basis of the launching an insurrection in Germany. How the hell are you going to convince a trade union conference with reformist leaders being there that that's going to be the basis of an insurrection? I don't know. But anyway, they tried to Brandler spoke for, I think, 4 hours to try and convince this conference, and they voted it down. And therefore, the insurrection, which they planned, was called off, and everything was a complete shambles. Well, it led to a disaster in Hamburg, where there was an insurrection actually took place, and isolated as it turned out, and it was put down in cold blood. But they missed the opportunity, and as a result, I mean, I can't go into all the details because it'll take too long. But the situation was missed. And like everything else, a revolutionary situation doesn't last indefinitely. It lasts for a short period of time, relatively speaking. Could be weeks, could be months. It doesn't necessarily last longer than that. You have an opportunity to move quickly if you can. But if you fail it, then the situation flows in the opposite direction, and you miss the opportunity. It's exactly what happened. Trotsky came out with a pamphlet then, The Lessons of October, explaining that there was a crisis of leadership, and the need to learn from Bolshevism, which was important. That's the whole idea of lessons. Zinoviev and that said, oh, no, it's still a revolution. Don't worry, a revolution's coming. It's coming. There was a defeat, man. And they were talking about revolution. It was still on the order of the day. They were changing, they were flipping their position in 1924. In other words, it was a bit of a mess. Only Trotsky had a clear understanding and produced this pamphlet, which you can get online, The Lessons of October, which really analyzes the importance of leadership, above all in a revolution situation, and drawing the lessons of the Bolshevik Party and how it should be organized. Of course, this led to a defeat, and the defeat then led to a certain stabilization. In 1923, Hitler tried to launch a coup, which failed miserably. So the Hitler movement this time was a very tiny little group, together with lots of other small fascist organizations, mainly from the military wing, which after the war and so on and so forth. And the bourgeoisie were trying to look for some sort of stability, and it came. I mean, in America, you had the Roaring Twenties and so on. In Germany, there was a certain stability after 24, 25, 26, to 28. And then you had the Wall Street crash and the world slump. And in Germany, unemployment rocketed to 6 million. And the problem we had at that time, by 1929, is the Communist Party then became a Stalinist organization. They removed the leadership. Brandler was removed. They imposed another leadership. That was removed. Imposed another leadership. Every leadership was removed at one point or another. The Stalinists began to more and more consolidate their position in Russia. The left opposition was expelled. Trotsky was exiled. And the consequences were disastrous. Because from opportunism, we have moved towards ultra-leftism. In 1928, they come forward with what is known as the third period. The first period was on a revolution. Second was stability. Now it was all-out revolution. But and they said that the main enemy was social democracy, and they were called social fascists. The fascists, you had radical fascists, the social fascists, the liberal fascists, the fascist fascists. Everybody's a fascist except the Communist Party, of course. They were the Communist Party, and everybody else fascist. And that confused and disorientated, and it was a disastrous policy. It split the German working class, as you can imagine. In fact, the whole basis in Germany, because they were a mass organization in Germany still. If it was a tiny group, well, it didn't make any difference, but they were a mass organization. Instead of appealing to the German working class and for united front action against the rising menace of fascism after 1930, because you have to go, even by 1930, there were opportunities. Unfortunately, they had a mad policy, attacking the Social Democrats, attacking the children in the schoolyards were Social Democrat kids. Then they had called a referendum in Prussia to bring down the Social Democratic government in alliance with the fascists. They called it the Red Referendum. I mean, mad ideas. A strike, the transport workers' strike in 1931. There's this fascists and the Communist Party collecting money for this strike. I mean, complete confusion. Breaking up Social Democratic meetings. It was incredible confusion, and they were the main enemy. And that resulted in the splitting of the German working class, right down the middle. Complete confusion. And they were the biggest working class in the whole of the world. Anyone saying that communist movement was the biggest out of Russia? The German working class was extremely powerful, and fascism at that stage was not a mass movement. It was only 1930 was the big turning point, where the fascists then took off. Why? Because the defeats and the demoralization in the petty bourgeoisie in particular, of the middle classes, which were ruined by the crisis of 1929, ruined by the capitalist crisis. They were looking for miracles. And the middle class could be won to a revolutionary program, that's the point. But if you can't win if that's absent, they will look for other avenues. And the fascists, because now they got finance from big business. Henry Ford, I think, was one of them. Also, also in Britain, Churchill, a great war leader, he was in favor of Mussolini and Hitler. The ruling class in Britain were in favor, don't worry, of teaching the German working class a lesson. Certainly only later on, because it conflicted with the interests of British imperialism, they switched their line, as it were. But the German working class was so powerful at that time, but split and paralyzed. And as a consequence, because the fascist movement is a petty bourgeois movement. It's the ruined and enraged middle classes who are being driven to madness. And they used as a battering ram, a physical battering ram, against the labor movement to crush the workers. And you had a series of crisis governments, of Brüning, of von Papen, of Schleicher's governments. All these are Bonapartist governments. A crisis within Germany. The ruling class pouring more and more money into the fascist gangs and the Hitler movement. It now becomes a powerful, one of the biggest parties in the Reichstag because of this. And then the Communist Party said, nevertheless, we're the winners. It's victory for us. And the German, they got what, a 45% increase in votes, great. And the fascists got 800% increase in votes. And they said what a great victory for communism. They lost all sense of proportion, all sense of reality. And continued with this program of divisions in the working class. The main enemy is the social democracy. Right up until January 1933, where Hitler then was appointed chancellor. And that he was so in a democratic way, a legitimate democratic way, a minority coalition. Of course, he had the key places in the government, and was able to use that in order to create the conditions for a fascist victory. Because in November 1932, they never had a majority, and that was the last democratic election. In fact, their votes went down by 2 million in 1932. They were in a crisis situation. And the social democracy and the German communists had more votes than the fascists. And what we're getting at here is the balance of forces, if you like, is tilting against the working class. The only way it was a united front, as Trotsky argued for, right up to 1933. A united front of the workers to smash the fascists. If you don't have the united front, you're going to be destroyed. And that's exactly what happened. The Social Democrats capitulated. And the Stalinists, they had the position, was his name Talman. After Hitler, our turn. After Hitler, our turn. The fascists are going to destroy the movement. They're a special form of reaction. They're not the same as any other form. They will use physical violence, physical force, to destroy the labor movement. And that's what happened. The trade unions were made illegal, the Socialist Party was declared illegal, the Communist Party, and you had the Reichstag fire and all the rest. All these were just excuses to smash. And the trade union leaders, they were bowing down to them. We'll have an alliance with this. In May Day in 1933, we were looking, which Hitler called a Labor Day, a national Labor Day. The trade union leaders were all in favor of it, until they were marched off to the concentration camps. And the Communist Party said, nevertheless, their position was correct even after the victory of Hitler. That's why Trotsky said this organization's dead. If you can't draw the conclusions of that, it's finished. And therefore, you could see that Germany went through the horrors, if you like, the enormous potential of revolution and the horrors to do not with the strength of the working class, but the failure of revolutionary leadership. And our task is to learn the lessons of the defeats and the victories, because these lessons are drenched in blood. And the workers are sacrificing everything. And all we have to do is learn. So we do, you know, history repeats itself, but on a higher level. And of course, the working class has never been stronger today than any time in history. These fascist groups are very, very tiny. They'll not get all these, the petty bourgeois revolutionaries. Oh, fascism around the corners. That's rubbish. The movement is to the left, the revolutionary movement, as we can see now. And the opportunity is enormous for us. But if there's defeat and defeat and defeat and defeat, that will open up the way for reaction. And therefore, we have to learn these lessons to prepare the way for the building of the IMT, the building of the American section of the IMT, preparing for the American Revolution and the world revolution itself.